Testing 1, 2, 3. Everybody hear me okay? Brilliant. If there's any problems with the audio, then wave your arms frantically. But we seem to be all good so far. So brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining here at Big Data London 2021. It's great to be back doing these events in person. We've got a 30-minute slot today. I'm going to give you a quick introduction, some context to what I'm going to be explaining about. I'll introduce myself, I'll introduce Matillion, the company, and then I will talk about the platform, and then I will spend most of the presentation talking about the specific DevOps / DataOps scenario that I'm going to describe, and I'll explain, of course, why it's called Taming the Beast. My name is Ian Fennell. I'm Matillion's Manager of Developer Relations. I've been with the company about 5 years. We called it Taming the Beast because it's quite a difficult thing to do. There are 4 main parts, I think, to any scenario where you're trying to get value out of data. Number 1, you've got to get your data in. You've got to extract and load it somehow into your platform. Number 2, you've got to transform and integrate, get all those disparate data sources so that they are in a position where you can integrate them, get joined up intelligence. Third part is you've got to get that intelligence back out somewhere else, perhaps into a BI tool, or perhaps into an AI/ML algorithm, or perhaps it's back into one of the source systems again, what we would call reverse ETL. And then fourth, and perhaps the biggest challenge of all, you've got to automate that wherever possible, do it as quickly as possible. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on the fourth part of that, but I wanted to give you that context up front, and that's why that's the thing we're trying to tame in this demo. I did toy with the idea of doing a live demo. If anybody saw the previous one, I wasn't that brave, but instead what I'm going to do is I've got a lot of screenshots and some narrative, and I'm going to spend the bulk of this presentation talking through those, so it'll be quite technically in depth as I go through the slides. Matillion Limited, first of all, I'm proud and delighted to be able to say, first of all, we're the UK's newest tech unicorn. The news didn't get released, it was only a couple of days old actually, otherwise I would have stuck a unicorn on the slide. The value proposition that we have a number of products in the platform. The value proposition is similar for all of them. Ease of use, trying to solve those first 3 things in the problem there I described. So there's lots of graphical user interfaces, and I'll show you some screenshots of those. It's entirely cloud native, and there are security features built in, like use of secrets manager, and all the scalability that you would need for an enterprise, of course, as well. A key thing is that co-location of data is not the same as integration. So you can put everything side by side, like everybody sitting side by side here in this theater, doesn't mean we know each other. Those 2 things are very different. So Matillion's products use a cloud data warehouse to solve that problem. And we have integrations with all the main cloud native platforms like Snowflake, Databricks, Azure, etc. So I will show you here. Actually, if I was doing a live demo, I would be switching over to show you what the product actually looks like. There's a screenshot of it there. This is Matillion ETL, our core and original product. As you can see, it's a graphical interface. That's a screenshot of about the simplest job that you can build with it, but it does nicely illustrate the kind of core way it works, in that it's actually an ELT tool, despite the fact that it's named ETL. Step 1 is an extraction and load, where you get hold of all your data and you load it into somewhere. And step 2 is the transformation and integration step. An important thing is that when you are using this, it's backed up by a virtual machine which you own as the customer of Matillion. And that's an important thing that will be relevant when I start talking about DevOps. It's not hosted on your behalf by Matillion Limited. You own the VM. So you can start and stop it, you control the access to it, you control the firewalls, etc. The interface is primarily graphical. but we like to call it a code optional experience. So in fact, we have 2 talks later on this afternoon, 2 more polls, confusingly enough, from Matillion, talking about different extensibility options, including create your own connector. Okay, so I'm going to talk through this scenario now in a bit more detail that I'm going to be spending the bulk of the time of this presentation on. You don't have to be working in the data engineering or related industries for very long before you realize that everything's in a permanent state of change. As soon as you get hold of your data, you figure out how to deal with all those strange and unusual formats, you get it loaded into your area ready for transformation and integration, you get a dashboard that's to the liking of the users, or the machine learning model starts to work, and he goes out and it gets in front of the business, and 10 seconds later, what happens is that they go, that's not quite what I meant, or interesting, I've now thought of another question, and the whole thing goes circularly back again. And in fact, I would go as far as to say, if that isn't happening, there's probably something wrong. If you're not in a permanent state of change, then maybe you need to get more in touch with delivering value to the business. The point there is that it needs to be underpinned by something that is agile, something that's going to enable agility, and that's what I'm going to describe in this particular scenario. A lot of our customers, enterprise customers, have, of course, you don't just do one. You don't have one Matillion interface instance. You don't have one database. They've got many of them. The previous speaker, interestingly, was talking about that aspect of automation. Here I'm going to talk of the 3 things: development, change control, and DevOps automation. I'm going to concentrate on the 3rd part of that. I'm not going to talk about how the developers do their work or about the change control process. I'm going to focus on trying to automate that last part of that as much as possible. I'm going to be using Azure Devops and its close link with GitHub throughout this. As the previous speaker said, I would also say this is one of many possible scenarios. Everybody wants to do something slightly different, which is unique to their particular setup. But this is end-to-end, and it's a realistic situation. Okay, let me go to the next one. I have to have an architecture slide here, so I'll spend a couple of minutes talking through this. Kind of starts confusingly at the bottom left there, where the Matillion development team is doing their work. They are creating the data ingestion, transformation, and integration jobs in the dev environment. Hopefully they're using some big volumes of data, but it's deliberately segregated in that dev environment. When they finish their work, or when they think they have, they save that, or they give it as input to some change control process. The way that we do that with Matillion ETL is through artifacts, which are just JSON files. So those are the things which are going to go into the change control process. Those are the things which are going to be the kind of units of deployment that get automatically pushed into Matillion production, which is over there on the right-hand side. So interestingly, because we're using GitHub here, it is actually inside the Azure cloud as well. The repository is hosted in Azure, and the automation part of GitHub is the runners. Those runners container instances inside Azure as well. So far so good. But there are a couple of things, a couple of barriers, deliberate security barriers that you need to get around if you are doing some automation here. Firstly is that the Matillion production instance has got a network security group around it. It's certainly not going to accept a code push from some anonymous runner, whether or not it comes from Azure or from somewhere else. We have to actually open the physical access for it to be able to push that code into the instance. Secondly, even if you did have that open, you would still need a set of credentials in order to use the REST API to authenticate yourself into the REST API. So the network security group, I'm going to be talking about how you automate that aspect of things. That's not too difficult. It's an Azure CLI command that you can execute to do that. But getting the privilege to do that is something else as well. So I'm going to be talking about how you give that GitHub runner the actual privilege to update the network security group. All of those things are key to the automation. So all of this is kicked off by a git push operation, which is here. So once again, if I was doing a live demo here, I would be switching over to my screen, but it would look like that. So a couple of things to point out. You can actually see the git commands here. There are 3 of them. There's it's the operator, the DevOps operator, telling it this file is new, and you can see, might be a bit small, but it's a JSON file that we're adding into the Git repository here. There's a commit, and there is a push. Now, I was talking before about Matillion's core value proposition being ease of use and graphical interfaces and that kind of thing. But here I am talking about command line interfaces and scripting and that sort of thing, simply because that is more easy to automate. So if it's very difficult to automate interaction through a UI, but here when with Git commands, you can put those into a script. So this is key to the automation. So all being well, fingers crossed, that is all that the operator has to do after the change control process has accepted the changes. Of course, they do those 3 things, and they're in a script or whatever, and that's ready to go. That kicks off the process of the automation process. So I am going to spend the next few slides. They'll all look fairly similar. I'll have a little section of the YAML file from the configuration of the GitHub Workflow, and I'll have a screenshot of what that looks like in GitHub Actions. But before I dived into those slides, I wanted to give a little summary of the half dozen or so sections within there that form this part of the automation. There's some kind of wrapper stuff that you just get, boilerplate things with these workflow scripts. So I'll start with the sync repository. When the runner instances launch in GitHub, they are just basically empty Linux instances. They have a CLI and an operating system, but not much else. So the sync of the repository gets the code into that instance, and it gets all the code, by the way. So there might be thousands of Matillion jobs. There might be many hundreds of DDL scripts, declarative permissions things set up. There might be machine learning models, all sorts in there. So it's very important in order to make life easy, to make the automation fast, to just focus in on the changes. So we don't want to commit 1,000 jobs over to production because they're identical. Only look at what's changed. And I'll show you the way that you can do that using Git. Then there are 3 closely related things. How do you get through the network security group? Well, you need to know your public IP address, first of all. Then you need to update the network security group with that public IP address, but you need to log in to Azure in order to do that. So there are 3 closely related steps. And then having done all of those things, I'll show you how you can automate the push of the code into Matillion using the REST API. So hopefully that gives some context on the next few slides that I'm going to show. So this is the first of the slides. You can see the kind of YAML fragment up the top there of what would actually be in the workflow file, and then below there's a screenshot from a real execution of this that I did just to test it. So one thing to notice is, because once again of the tight integration between Azure DevOps and GitHub and Git, it's really easy to do this. You just do this actions checkout, and you can actually see, hopefully it's not too small, kind of fourth line down, you can see even the location where it gets checked out to. So at this point, all of the artifacts, whatever they're relating to, are now available to the runner for use in the automation. So far so good. That's probably the easiest bit. Now we only want to look at what has changed. So again, we can use a git CLI command here. You can see a diff filter which is added or modified files. That's the AM filter. We only want to see the file names. We don't want to look at the actual contents of the file. We don't want to look at that yet. And there are some nice handy macros that you can use, like the GitHub event before and after, which narrow it down to the one commit that we're interested in here. Remembering that this will run for every single commit. We want it to run often and fast and fail early if that's what it's going to do as well. Because this is basically a script, we can use a grep command. That's a pretty simple one. I'm just looking for JSON files. So remember I said the Matillion metadata exchange format is JSON files. If there are DDL scripts or whatever else in here that's changed, I'm not interested in them from the Matillion perspective, so I'm not going to deal with those as part of this particular bit of the automation. That does save information into /tmp, which you can use, and I'll be coming back to that file in a couple of steps' time. So that diffs.dat file, that's going to be useful. The runners don't last for very long. The container instances only run for a couple of minutes, but you can save information in that way. There's also another way, which I'll show you in the next slide. This is how you find your public IP address. So I'm going to need that piece of information in order to tell Matillion to accept a post request from this runner in a minute. So interestingly, I'm using basically an Azure system here, but I've called out to if you look carefully, it's an Amazon API. It's a REST endpoint check IP. Now, partly because it's interesting, it's a mixture of tech, partly because I couldn't actually find one in AWS, in Azure that did something similar. If anybody does know of one, I'd be interested to hear, so please pop by the booth and tell me about it. But there's actually maybe an advantage from doing that as well, in that we don't know much about the GitHub runners. They might be behind a load balancer, they might be behind a reverse proxy or a NAT gateway or many other things. So going completely outside into a completely external service is guaranteed to give you the real public facing IP that other people will see. So it's quite handy in that respect. The way to save this information is something that's specific to GitHub Actions. And that is in the very last line there, it gets saved into a GitHub env, and it sets a variable called pub IP, and that's the one I'll be using in a couple of screens' time. That's basically the IPv4, the dotted address that we need to grant access to. And you can see an example, a screenshot down there. Okay, so we've got the public IP address. We now in a position to update the network security group. But in order to do that, I have to log in to Azure, first of all. As you would expect, the Azure CLI is not going to accept an instruction from somebody who hasn't authenticated. So this is something that is built in if you set up your repository through Azure DevOps. It sets up this Azure credentials for you. It also sets up an identity within Azure, which is the thing which is identified by those credentials. They get set up as a secret inside GitHub. It's a GitHub secret in there. And again, it's very easy because of the tight integration. It just logs you on. So far so good. Little bit more complicated one. This is one line. It's an AZ command, NSG rule update command. It works, first of all, because we have authenticated into Azure, so we are permitted to update this network security group. The one thing I'm not showing you here, by the way, which is a one-off setup that you do need to do once in your Azure account, is you need to give that identity the privilege to update the network security group. And you need to just give it only that privilege and absolutely nothing else. And it's in that way that it gets the kind of transient role-based access control that it needs to update the network security group here. So everything's parameterized. All those are secrets, the rule name, the network security group itself, and the resource group. And that env.pub IP, that's it, picking up the public IP address again of the runner, which is going to be different every single time this thing runs. So all being well, that has now granted permission for the GitHub runner to at least talk to the Matillion instance. So that's a basic prerequisite. We then have got to update, to actually push that, push the code changes into the Matillion production instance. If you remember the architecture diagram, it's that kind of last REST API push that was over on the right-hand side there. This script is rather the most complicated one of them all. But if you look carefully, there is a loop in here. You remember that diffs.dat file that we created a few screens ago? We're looping through the lines in that file now. So there may be nothing in there, by the way. It may be completely empty, in which case this will just do nothing. And if it is just a DDL or a change to an algorithm or a permission, something like that, we don't need to change the jobs, but we do need to take some action. So it's not Matillion specific. This will quietly do nothing under those circumstances. Also, so there's actually two parts to the Matillion API. There is a pretty big, rich REST API with Matillion. These are two of the endpoints. Most of the things are parameterized, especially the credentials that you need to access it. That's the metal secret that I've got with the -u option. Also the URL, because that might be different. You want to parameterize that. Your production instance might be behind a DNS, or it might you might switch it off and on again, that kind of thing. So that's parameterized as well. And you will see the job name is one of the parameters there, and there's a delete operation followed by a post operation which recreates the job. So that in that way it's like a merge in SQL. It deletes the thing and then recreates it. So that's actually, I think that's our last stage in the automation. If you were a DevOps operator and you were watching this in GitHub, you would see a thing that looks like the screenshot at the top there. I've in fact been showing you screenshots from the log which is in there, but that's what it looks like in GitHub. It also looks very much the same in Azure DevOps, because those are basically two highly integrated consoles. If you were looking at Matillion ETL, if you happened to be logged in production, which is probably pretty rare, it's going to be a very locked down server, but if you happened to be looking at the job at the time, and there's a screenshot of one right there, you would see it disappear as the post delete operation takes effect, and then you would see it immediately reappear with all the changes. So it's very fast, basically. So that's what it looks like from the operator's perspective. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of the demonstration. I wanted to just re-summarize what I was just talking about and highlight the important things there. This applies very much where typical enterprise scenario, you have more than one Matillion instance. That's the beast of a problem you need to solve, which is to get that new code selectively and automatically into your new target environment. I'm using Azure DevOps, taking advantage of its tight integration with GitHub Actions. So that's what does all of the automated work there. I didn't talk at all about the approval process, so this kicks in. There's a whole long conversation to be had about that, of course, as well. But this kicks in after that's taken place, and this is the automation part after that approval has taken place. So, in summary, this is one way of integrating your Matillion ETL code with a DevOps tool to give you data ops type functionality. It was end-to-end, and it caters for cases where the repository has got not just Matillion jobs, but perhaps a whole bunch of other things in there as well. Thank you for all being here. It's been great to be talking again in person. I will be at booth 608 if anybody has questions after this. Or you don't need to be a customer for this. Please feel free to join our Matillion community. There's lots of Q&A and conversations going on about this and other subjects. So thanks all. Enjoy the rest of the show.